we are doing very good, and this is time to add a very interesting feature to our chat. Currently, we have our chat working perfectly good, but now we are going to go simple, and this is going to allow us to explore the private channels, but for specific user. That means that only one user can receive a message, or only one user can receive one event or one notification, etc. Currently, we are using private channels to determine if a user can connect or not. But now, more than that, we are going to verify if not only the user exists, but if this user is the one that must receive the message. So even when the user exists, if that user is not identified with some credentials or with a specific ID, so that user is not going to be allowed to check the message or the event that is receiving. So what we are going to do for this is allowing to click from one user to another, and the message, or basically the chat, is going to notify to the user that has been touched or has been greeted. Basically, we are sending greetings between users on private. So user 1 can send a greet to user 2. So only user 2 can see that greet, and user 1 can see that sent the greet. But if there is user 3, user 4, user 5, none of them are going to see any of those messages. So let's just start with the visual components from the beginning as usual. For that, what we are going to do is, in our view, we are going to create an on-click event, let's say, our chat show, of course, and once the user clicks on the username, it is going to execute a function that is going to send, or let's say dispatch, the greet. So we are creating, or basically adding, elements to the list of users here and exactly here. So what we are going to do on those lines is to set a new attribute, which is going to be, instead of ID, onClick, and the value of onClick is going to be the call to a function that we are going to call, again, greet user. So to greet the user, we just need to specify between quotations the name, or basically, in fact, the ID, the unique ID of this user. So let's close the single quotation here and add a variable which is the user ID. So we have here user.id. In both cases, we have access to the user variable. So now what we have to do is to create this function into our script. So let's go here, add a new script just to be a little organized. And there we are going to add a function which is going to be called greetUser, receiving, of course, the ID of the user that we are going to greet. This is basically the receiver of that specific greet. So now what we are going to do is to send an Axios request, and this is going to be post. Then we are going to call to chat greet, and the only thing that we have to do is send into this URL the ID of this user. We are not going to send anybody. We don't need to send any message. We are just going to specify that we want to greet the user with this specific ID. So, of course, this root does not exist yet, so we are going to create that. So let's go to routes, web.php, and there we are going to duplicate this one. Of course, again, this is going to change. We are going to call this chat greet. But additionally, we are going to receive a variable which is the ID of the user. We are going to identify a user from the value that we receive. Then we are going to call a different action which is greet received, and the name is going to be chat.greet. So once we have this, we need to go to our controller, chat controller, and create this action. So let's go there, app http controllers, chat controller. And there we have a public function, greet received, and from greet received, well, we are going to use the request as usual to validate specifically the user that is sending this greet and the receiver of the greet. So we are going to receive here the user, and Laravel is going to take care of us to automatically resolve the user from the ID that we are receiving. Of course, if the user does not exist, so it is going to fail with a 404 response. At this point, we should broadcast the message, we should broadcast to the user, to the receiver, to the sender, etc. But for now, we are just going to return a generic response saying greeting, some specific user, the one that we are identifying here, name, from the user that is authenticated at this moment. So we have request user. Remember, this one is a method, and there we need the name of this specific user. So now, once the user clicks on this, we are executing this action and we should be allowed to check that message. But finally, just to be a little consistent with the experience of the user, we are going to add a little style here to show the cursor when the user is over this. So remember, we have an element with ID users, which inside has the list items, and inside we are going to use a cursor, which is going to be pointer. So once we have this, let's go to verify if everything is working properly. So let's do refresh here, let's do refresh here, open the console in both sides. So if I click on test2, I had a little error because, of course, here, when I'm calling Axios, this should be only window, on singular, of course. So let's do refresh now to be sure everything is working. Once again, if I click on this user, there is an internal error. Let's verify just to be sure what is the problem. And it's saying, of course, that user does not exist. So let's go back faster and import the definition of user directly from the model, of course. So let's try again. This is going to be probably the last issue. Let's do refresh just in case. Click on this user, and there we have a success request, and you can see greeting test2 from test2 because I clicked on the same user. If I click on test1, so you can see here, I send a request to 1 saying greeting test1 from test2, and of course this is going to work exactly the same here. If I click on test2, this is going to say greeting test2 from test1. So this is sending the request, this is receiving the element, it is basically handling the receiver and the sender, and now we are going to deal with the event that we are going to create in the following class, and of course how to broadcast that. See you there. Currently, we have a burst part of the functionality here, but we need to go to the backend and continue with the broadcasting of the event of the greeting. So currently, we are receiving the request once the user clicks on the name of another user, usually. And now what we have to do is, well, to receive that request, use the authenticated user, the receiver user, and broadcast the event for that. But before of broadcasting an event, well, we need to create the event. So let's just start with that. And remember, this is going to be a very special event because we need to play a little with the channel because only the receiver and the sender can be the ones that can connect to that specific channel and receive the notifications or basically the messages. So let's go to create the event, and we are going to use a very similar one, which is message send. So let's duplicate this, and we are going to call this greeting send. Once we have this, well, as the same as the message, we are going to receive the user and the message itself. But in the case of the user, we don't need to share a lot of information about the user, so we are just going to use that internally, but we are not going to broadcast the details about the user because there we are going to already know who is the sender and who is the receiver. So we are going to use the user as a protected attribute. We are going to resolve the current user, the message, etc. And then we are not going to use a presence channel. We are going to use a private channel. Remember to import the definition from Illuminate Broadcasting. And then we need to play with the name of the channel. Results that we are going to go to chat.greet. But the part that comes here is the part good, because we are going to use here the ID of the user. What user? Well, the user that we received in the constructor, which could be the sender or even the receiver. So basically changing here the user that we sent when broadcasting this event specifically, we can manage who can receive or not this event. So here we are going to use this user ID. So that means this is going to say chat grid 1 or chat grid 2 or 3 or 4 or etc. And only the user with ID 1 or with ID 2 or with ID 3 should be able to connect here. And here comes the detail. We need to specify a new channel in our root and specify the authentication logic. So let's go to root, channels, and there we are going to add a new one. So let's copy, for example, this one. So this is going to be chat, grid, and there we are going to have the receiver. Both of them are users, but this one is the instance of the user, while this one, the receiver, is only the ID of the user. So this is an instance of the user, and this is only a number with the identifier. So we need to make a comparison here. If the user ID is equals to the receiver, exactly the same, so that means that this user is the destinatary of that event and can receive that. That's good. But if it is not true, so that user cannot connect to this channel and cannot receive the messages. That's all. Only the authenticated user can connect to this specific channel and receive the messages that we are sending there. Let's save this. And now that we have the event that we can broadcast and we have the authentication logic for this event, we can go to our controller. So let's go to HTTP controllers chat controller, and we have the grid received element there. We are going to broadcast the events as we need. So let's go to call this broadcast, and we are going to broadcast two events of this grid and send. One for the receiver and other for the sender, but with different messages and of course with different receivers. The first one, we are going to notify the person that receives the grid, and in the second one, we are going to notify the person that is sending the request, just like a confirmation. So in the first one, we are going to receive the user that is the receiver, because this is resolved here based on the URL of the request, and we are going to send this message. We are going to use the user that is authenticated here. So we access the user from the request, and we are going to say that this user with this specific name is greeting this other one. So as it is going to this user, we are going to say, hey, test2, for example, greeted you. And then in the second scenario, we are going to use the request, the user from the request. So that means that we are going to send this now to the sender, and we are going to say, you greeted this user. So now we are not going to use the request, we are going to use the user that we received as a parameter of this function. So the receiver is going to say, hey, someone greet you. And the sender is going to say, hey, you greeted this other user. So this is basically what we are doing here. And that is the reason because we don't need the user itself. We don't need to broadcast the user because the message already includes who is the sender of the element. Now, of course, those elements need to be part of the code to the constructor of this greeting sent. So let's create the instances here directly from the constructor, of course, and be sure to import the definition of greeting sent. Once we have this, we are able to broadcast these elements, and we can try to debug a little, going to greeting sent, and then we are going to add log debug, and we are going just to debug the message to check what we are receiving. So if everything is okay, we should be able to go here or here. Let's refresh in both sides. And we are going to say that test2 is going to greet to test1. If everything is okay, we should be able to go to storage, logs, log, and there you have test2 greeted you, and you greeted test1. Remember, the first one is saying the message for the receiver, and the second one is saying the message for the sender. That means that this is working perfectly good, And now we need to go to the following class to see how to show those messages to the corresponding users using the authentication and the dynamic channel name. See you there. So yes, you are almost there, and the only one thing that we have to do now is to go add the script that listens to the private channel using level echo, of course, for that greeting sent, and just add the elements, the messages to the respective users. Only the implicated users, it means the sender and the receiver, are going to be allowed to see this message. Another kind of user is not going to be allowed to do that. So let's see how it is going to work, because there is an interesting part that making dynamic the usage of the ID of the user that can connect to this channel or not. So let's go there. We are again in resources, views, chat, and there we have show.blade.php. So let's go to the bottom and add a new script, the last one in fact. And there we are going to use Laravel Echo as well. This time this is a private channel. This time the name of the channel is a little different. And after that we have the variable component. Remember, here we should have the ID of the user that is currently authenticated, because only that user can listen for its own messages. No other user can listen to this. So even when somebody put the other user's ID, it is going to fail, because we are requiring first that there exists a user authenticated and that the ID specified here is going to match with the ID of the user authenticated. So here we just need to access to the authenticated user without user, and from there we just need the ID. So once it is there, we are going to listen for that specific event, which is, remember, greeting send. So we have there an action receiving the event itself. And what we are going to do is to insert an element on the list of messages. So this is basically what we have here when we have a message sent. So let's to copy this to take this as an advantage. So we have the element, which is going to be a list item. Then in the inner text, the only thing that we have to do is to put the message that we receive from the event. This is going to say test2 greet you, or you greet test1, or something like that. This is exactly the message, and the message itself is taking care of determining the name of the user that we want to use there. And now, just to add a little of style, we are going to specify this on green to differentiate visually this from the regular messages. So let's to say element class list add, and we are going to use text success. So now, if everything is okay, we should be able to go here. Let's to refresh in both cases, just to be sure. And let's imagine that test2 is going to greet to test1. So test2 clicks on test1. And there you have. You greeted test1. And in the test1 side, it's saying test2 greeted you. Now, let's imagine that test2 wants to salute or greet to itself or himself. So only test2 can see the messages and test1 cannot see anything. So let's to click on test2. So you can see how test2 is the sender and the receiver in both cases, while test1 didn't receive anything. So at this point you can be sure that this is working perfectly on private mode. Even when you change your code and say that this wants to connect to, for example, the test1, this is going to fail because the IDs are not going to match. And of course, if test1 sent a greet to test2, so you are going to see you greeted test2 and test1 greeted you on the side of test2. Once again, if test1 salutes or basically greet to itself, so it is going to see only him the messages, and the test2 is not going to get anything, because in this case the messages were completely private for this specific user. That's all. At this point you already explored all the types of channels that you can use, and you were able to use all the characteristics and the ways to transmit or broadcast on real-time events for your users. See you in following classes.